Dawn of War 4 has recently had a battle report between the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Necrons, and well, after seeing the Adeptus Mechanicus in action in the previous video, it's only right and fair that the Necrons now have a turn to take center stage. Today's video is going to do just that. Now, the Necrons do look pretty slow, pretty resilient, and packed with technology, but once the match actually gets underway, it also becomes clear that they have some key systems that work very differently from the rest of the factions in Dawn of War 4. From things like how they gather resources, to how they reinforce armies, and even how they move around the battlefield. Rather than trying to overwhelm their opponents with speed or brute force, the Necrons gradually take control of the map until fighting them on their own terms becomes incredibly difficult. Now, the first thing that the Necrons player looks to focus on is the expansion of its power matrix. Unlike the other factions, Necrons don't actually rely on the usual combination of requisition and power. Instead though, they generate a single resource called Dominion, and the main way of increasing it is by spreading the power matrix through almost every structure that they build. Now, as that network grows across the map, Dominion income increases as well, but that's only actually really half the story because the matrix also directly supports nearby armies. Units that stand inside the matrix actually regenerate their health faster, missing squad members get reinforced more quickly, and the units on the matrix also make far better use of the natural repair system for the Necrons. So really, expanding your territory isn't just about improving your economy, but you're also creating ground where your entire army becomes a lot harder to wear down. So one structure that actually plays a huge part in all of this is the convergence of Dominion, which is one of the fastest and cheapest ways to extend the power matrix into new territories. Looking back at the battle report, you can actually see this happening throughout the match. The Necron player keeps dropping these structures further forward, gradually expanding the matrix until key areas of the battlefield are completely covered by it. Now, the mechanic is pretty interesting, especially when comparing it with the Adeptus Mechanicus, because even though both factions are building networks across the map, they are actually doing it for very different reasons. The Adeptus Mechanicus expand their noosphere network to strengthen buildings, unlock new units, and reduce production costs, while the Necrons expand their power matrix to fuel their economy and keep their armies operating at maximum efficiency. They are both investing in infrastructure, but one is supporting industry, while the other is supporting an advancing legion. Now, the first units actually making that advance are the Canoptek scarabs, which are highly mobile, melee-capable units, but with relatively little durability. They kind of look best when flying straight into ranged squads and locking them in combat, preventing those enemy units from making proper use of their weapons. In fact, that is exactly what we saw against the Skitarii Rangers early on in the match, where the scarabs repeatedly tied them up long enough for the rest of the Necron force to move into position. They aren't there really to win the fights on their own, but they can clearly create openings that other heavier units for the Necrons could take advantage of. Speaking of which, those heavier units, well, we should probably begin with the Necron warriors. They look like the dependable backbone of the faction. They're effective against a wide range of targets. They favor ranged combat. They don't move particularly quickly, but durability is clearly one of their biggest strengths, in this phase of the game at least. Just like the other factions in Dawn of War 4, reinforcing replaces any fallen members to restore the squad to full strength, and combined with the passive regeneration inside the power matrix, they are designed to stay on the field for a long period of time instead of constantly just cycling back to base. We do also get to look at one of their first weapon upgrades, which is the Gauss Reaper. This looks to equip warriors with increased range damage against light infantry, heavy infantry, vehicles, and structures, whilst also improving their maximum health. It clearly doesn't completely change their battlefield role, but it does make them scale much better into the mid-game instead of them becoming obsolete once heavier units arrive. Now, one thing that does stand out quite quickly though is just how slow most of these infantry units are. Normally that would leave them pretty vulnerable to faster armies, but the Necrons solve that problem in a pretty different way. Rather than increasing the movement speed, they actually build an entire transport network based around teleportation. The foundations of that system start with the Canoptek Foundry, which produces several of the faction's specialist constructs, whilst also extending the power matrix. Like most Necron buildings, it has to be placed inside the existing network, so every new production structure naturally strengthens the rest of your empire at the same time. Now, the Foundry also gives access to the Canoptek Spider, and this is where the teleportation system really starts coming together. The Spider can construct tomb pylons through an active ability, sacrificing itself in the process. At first, that does sound a little bit expensive, but those tomb pylons become forward deployment points that let the Necrons project their power across the battlefield without having to march reinforcements all the way from their base. That would be a pretty slow process, and so instead of solving mobility by making units faster, the Necrons solve it by making walking distance matter far less. And as the battle develops, it does look like you'll really need to spread that teleportation network across the map to stop yourself forever being run circles around. Now, especially on bigger maps, the teleportation network could actually be a pretty big advantage to create surprise attacks on your enemies. The network doesn't just stop there though, because we do get a look at the translocation science stratagem, which allows friendly units to teleport directly to a target location. Combining that with the tomb pylons, it means the Necrons always have some options for repositioning without relying on traditional transports or fast moving vehicles. It fits the faction pretty well, because I guess the Necrons are never really portrayed as an army that rushes into battle, rather they kind of methodically establish control before suddenly reinforcing that exact point where they are needed. Now, with the infrastructure in place, the battle naturally does shift towards larger engagements, and that's probably where one of the Necrons' most unique mechanics comes into play. It's with the Resurrection Gallery. So rather than replacing lost squads by spending more resources, these particular structures, the Resurrection Galleries, slowly rebuild destroyed units completely free of charge. There is a limitation though. Each Resurrection Gallery can actually only be assigned to a single type of unit in any one moment in time, and so deciding what to resurrect kind of becomes a pretty important strategic choice. You might just dedicate one to warriors, another to immortals, and maybe a third onto the Lich Guards, depending of course what your army needs the most. Now, if additional copies of that selected unit are destroyed while one is already being restored, the resurrection process does actually speed up. This will allow the Necron player to maintain a constant flow of reinforcements without repeatedly paying to replace entire squads. Now, I feel like this mechanic pretty much explains why the battle report repeatedly describes the Necrons as feeling like a tidal wave. Even after winning an engagement, your opponent isn't necessarily making permanent progress because many of those destroyed units are already being rebuilt behind the front line. The only real way to stop it, I guess, is to destroy the Resurrection Galleries themselves, and that's actually something that the Adeptus Mechanicus player eventually does in today's battle report when launching a counterattack into the Necron base. Now, the battle also introduced some of the specialist infantry that began replacing the humble warriors as the game progressed. Deathmarks are pretty much the first of those, filling the role of dedicated sniper infantry. Their long-range precision makes them pretty ideal for picking off valuable targets from hopefully a safe distance, giving the Necrons a way of threatening commanders or specialist squads before the main engagement even begins. Now, considering how durable most Necron units already appear to be, adding accurate long-ranged fire into the mix gives opponents another problem to deal with while the main army continues advancing. Immortals, on the other hand, look like a natural step up from warriors. They retain the faction's emphasis on durability, but offer significantly better firepower, making them reliable ranged infantry once the early game starts giving way to the larger battles. Now, they clearly aren't flashy units, but they do look like a pretty dependable backbone of the Necrons, especially when the elite roster comes in. Having said all that, for players who prefer a more tanky approach, Lich Guards appear to fill that role pretty well. Their tooltip confirms that they are exceptionally durable melee infantry, excelling at protecting nearby allies, while standing toe-to-toe with enemy assault units. They don't seem designed to chase enemies around the battlefield, but they certainly look like they'll make pushing into a Necron position as painful as possible. Now, the battle report also gave us a look at how the faction approaches static defenses, and unsurprisingly, those fit pretty neatly into the wider teleportation theme as well. Sentry pylons provide defensive firepower while supporting the expanding power matrix, but what really stands out is their ability to teleport. Instead of leaving defensive structures permanently anchored where they were first built, the Necrons can actually reposition them alongside an advancing front line. It sounds like a pretty small detail, but it does reinforce the idea that almost every part of the Necron faction is designed around steadily pushing forward rather than remaining tied to one section of the map. If you need heavier firepower though, the Gauss Pylon can step in. Unlike the smaller Sentry Pylon, this structure is built to threaten vehicles and heavily armoured targets from long range. It's certainly going to give the Necrons a proper defensive anchor, capable of protecting key areas of the battlefield, and it certainly complements the more mobile elements of the faction nicely, because while Tomb Pylons and Convergences of the Dominion help expand the network, Gauss Pylons make opponents think twice before trying to push into it. Now, by this stage of the battle, a pretty clear pattern has started to emerge. You need to expand the power matrix, establish a teleportation network, keep your core units alive through regeneration and resurrection, then steadily replace your frontline with increasingly powerful elites as your economy continues to grow. Everything in the faction does feel pretty connected, and I reckon it gives the Necrons one of the clearest battlefield identities that we've seen in Dawn of War so far. As the match does progress into the later stages though, the Necrons begin unlocking the units that really sell the faction fantasy. Some of them look incredibly awesome, and I think that's something that Dawn of War 4 is doing really well. Loads of the units from different factions just look totally epic, and up until this point with the Necrons, I guess the army has pretty much relied on warriors, but we do slowly start to get a sneak peek at the truly ancient war machines that make up the Necrons. Now, one of the first units to talk about is the Canoptek Wraith. It's a fast assault specialist designed to hunt high-value targets. Its tooltip shows that it's particularly effective against armor, but what really makes it stand out is hyper-phasing. It's an activatable ability that allows the Wraith to become temporarily invulnerable while moving to a target location. It lets the unit ignore obstacles and enemy units before emerging exactly where it's needed. In fact, we actually see that happening during the battle, where the Wraiths phase straight through the battlefield to attack vulnerable targets behind the Adeptus Mechanicus line. Instead of getting caught on screening infantry, they can simply bypass the defense entirely, giving the Necrons a way of threatening artillery, vehicles, or the expensive support units in the back line. Now, we also got to see the Destroyer Crypt structure, which unlocks, I feel, some of the Necrons' heaviest units, and signals its transition into the late game army. We don't get to see every unit that the Necrons can make, and actually in this particular battle report, they relied a lot on just the simple warriors that we never really got to see too many of the more specialist units. But having said that, at least we got to see some of the tooltips. What we should really talk about though is the Monolith. It's a Necron mobile fortress, combining impressive firepower with the ability to deploy units directly from reserves. Now, during battles, the Necron player can actually teleport the Monolith straight into the front line before immediately reinforcing through it, effectively creating a forward operating base in the middle of the battle. It looks pretty incredibly powerful because, well, with that, the Necrons can sustain their army and get the reserves right where they need them. Now, it also does kind of tie back into everything we've seen so far, because the power matrix supports the army, Tomb Pylons move reinforcements around the map, resurrection galleries replace fallen units, and now the Monolith allows those reinforcements to arrive directly where the fight is taking place. Now, we did also get a very sneak peek at the tooltip for the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon. We didn't get to see it in play, understandable, I guess they don't want to reveal everything, but with the Void Dragon being one of the most powerful Catan shards in the setting, and whilst we're only controlling a fragment of the true power here, it's still presented as one of the faction's ultimate battlefield assets. Just seeing it confirmed as part of the Necron roster is pretty exciting, but I obviously can't wait to see more detailed reveals in the future. Now, when it comes to stratagems, alongside the translocation science, which is instantly going to transport friendly units to a target location, we did actually talk about that a little bit earlier, but the Necrons do also have access to another couple of interesting stratagems. Gravity Pulse, for example, creates an area that deals damage over time, making it useful for pushing armies that try to hold ground or force their way through a choke point. While the Solar Pulse stratagem reduces the damage dealt by every enemy unit caught in its effect and completely negates cover for a short duration. That of course gives the Necrons another way of swinging important engagements, either by weakening an enemy assault or stripping away the defensive advantage of an entrenched infantry. To be honest, I could see that working really well against the Adeptus Mechanicus. Anyway, we also got a look at the protocol relay upgrade for the requisition points, and so that shows that the Necrons still can capture those points. Once installed, it actually prevents the enemy from recapturing that point as easily as it would without it, but it also does reduce the unit production time for the Necrons. Now of course, I imagine that there are a whole host of upgrades for the Necrons. We didn't actually get to see many of them in the battle report, but one that we did get to see was from the Resurrection Gallery that has an additional research upgrade called Undying Legions. Now this particular upgrade allows every resurrected or newly produced unit to begin with battle trait 1, with the exception of monoliths and the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon. So looking at everything together, the Necron roster feels pretty coherent. The economy revolves around Dominion instead of traditional resources, the power matrix rewards steadily expanding across the map, tomb pylons and translocation science solve mobility issues through teleportation rather than speed, resurrection galleries ensure that destroyed units don't necessarily stay destroyed, and the Necron late game roster builds naturally on those foundations instead of replacing them. It's also important to note, if you hadn't noticed already, that when it comes to requisition and power nodes, the Necrons can still benefit. When it comes to requisition points, it grants them increased unit production speeds, and when it comes to power nodes, it gives them reduced unit production costs. Overall, I think this battle report did a decent job of showing what makes the Necrons looking pretty unique. It does feel like there were still quite a few units and upgrades that weren't really too showcased, but hopefully we could get more of that in the future. Anyway, as always, I'm pretty curious to see what you guys think about the Necrons so far. What playstyle ideas or units are you most looking forward to getting your hands on? Let me know in the comment section below. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you did, make sure you give the video a thumbs up. Now just as a heads up, there will be an Ask Me Anything session with the developers of Dawn of War 4 coming up pretty soon. I'll of course be keeping you up to date with all of that when it happens, but until then, take care and see you next time.